Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, November 24th, and I thought maybe we can talk a little bit about Gaza.
Okay.
Ever since the ceasefire, I feel like Gaza has kind of started to slip from the news, and we've been talking about other stuff as well. And in a way, I feel like that's Israel kind of is getting away with it in a way, it
Yeah.
almost feels like. It seems like now people aren't talking about it. They just committed half a genocide. We were all about this and watching it on our phones and just horrified, and now it's just kind of slipping through the news, and I'm noticing everybody just like, oh well, let's talk about something else. I guess that Gaza thing is over now.
Right.
Where do we stand? It's not
Yeah.
over, right? I mean, what is happening?
It's definitely not over. The suffering continues, the horror continues. Not as many people are being killed, directly by Israeli bullets and bombs every day. That number has certainly gone down, but it hasn't stopped. I think it was just the day before yesterday that roughly 24 2 dozen Gazans were killed by Israelis in Israeli strikes, and again, like every time, the majority of them were civilians. A large proportion were children. I think we are now certainly over 300 total killed since the so-called ceasefire began. And then the suffering continues in other ways. Again, they're crammed into a very small piece of land. The Israelis are controlling over 50%. That's their side of the so-called yellow line. And the yeah the Gazans are within the remaining less than 50%. Their houses, their buildings have been destroyed. 90% have been destroyed or severely damaged. So the great majority are living in tents. I think there's something, I saw a figure the other day that 700,000 children are in tents. And these tents a lot of them are old and tattered. They've been using them, quite a bit over the last couple of years. And they're not able to withstand the weather. Recently, there were some heavy rains, cold weather. They flooded. They found these tents were flooded not just with rainwater, but with overflow from sewage, because again, the sewage plants have been destroyed. We don't have the imminent risk of total starvation, since there is a certain amount of food that's getting in. But it's, people are still very hungry. The Israelis are not sending the amount of humanitarian aid, including food, that they had committed to prior to the ceasefire. They were supposed to send in 600 trucks a day. They're sending in approximately 20% of that. That's what it's been over the course of the last few weeks since the ceasefire supposedly took hold. And again, they don't even have the equipment to clear the rubble, to find bodies that are certainly under there. It goes on and on. The suffering continues, the horror continues. And then on top of this, we got a UN resolution that, made this all official. This ceasefire agreement, Trump's 20-point peace plan, is in accordance with international law because it's been ratified by the UN Security Council. Some people were surprised or quite a few people were surprised and disappointed that the Russians and the Chinese did not veto it. Now, they both abstained. They were the only two parties to abstain, not to vote for it. And the Russians, prior to this, this vote, put forward an alternative plan that would have been really in keeping with prior UN resolutions and international law, and would have, again, recognized Palestinian statehood. But I think the reason that they didn't, I think there's at least a couple of reasons why they didn't veto it. Of course, being a member of the Security Council, the UN Security Council, they have the right to cast a veto vote. First of all, and I think probably most importantly, is they didn't get the support from Arab and Muslim nations. And in fact, the regional powers, Arab and Muslim, countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they were all actually in support of this peace plan. If you remember, I should say rather, Trump made a trip to the Middle East. First, he went to Israel, where he was lauded as like the greatest man since, the greatest Gentile since Cyrus the Great. And then he went off onto Cairo, and they had this big peace summit where we had this phony signing ceremony. And there again, that was in Egypt, and there was all these regional powers were applauding him. They have gone along with this. Turkey's Erdogan, they've gone along with this. They've been implicit in this, complicit, I should say. And then when the vote was actually taken, of course, there are no Arab or Muslim countries that are a part of the 5 members of the permanent UN Security Council, but there was a larger UN Security Council, and 2 of those were, we had Algeria and Pakistan, and they actually voted for this plan. So I think anyway, the Russians saw, well, not only will we be angering the United States, but we will actually be standing against what appears to be the Muslim and Arab consensus on this. And so they just chose to abstain. I think the other thing is that, of course, they've got their hands full with Ukraine. This for them is the existential battle. They're dealing with a very volatile person in the personality of Donald Trump. And this is Donald Trump's, one of his, let's say, favorite pet projects, maybe his favorite. This was like, he's told us many times that this is the first time that peace has come to the Middle East in something like 3,000 years, and it's because of him. He's Cyrus the Great, whatever. And it would clearly, if the Russians had vetoed it, it would have greatly angered him, and who knows how he would have reacted. It looks like they were preparing to do it. They had their alternative plan, but they just didn't get the support.
I mean, if they vetoed it and introduced their plan, wouldn't it just get vetoed by the U.S.? It wouldn't really go anywhere. So, well, what is this? Why is this plan? You're making it sound like it's a horrible thing for Gaza. What happens? Why is this so bad?
Yeah, well, I guess it gives it this, kind of the stamp of official approval, of UN approval. Maybe it won't change things very much. I've heard this argument out there. It's just that, well, the Russians and the Chinese looked at this and said, okay, maybe we can't stop this now, but this plan is bound to fail. Let's just let it go and fail, and then we'll come back to it. Maybe that's part of their thinking. But what it does with that stamp of UN approval, it makes it, of course, it protects it from criticism. You can always make the argument that, hey, we're just following international law. We're just following the UN resolution here. It's not just, Israel and the U.S., but it's in fact the whole world has agreed to this. So be quiet, right?
Right. But it should stop Israel from killing so many Palestinians in Gaza, right?
The problem with the plan is, if you look at it, when it comes down to it, it's just that the U.S. and Israel are pretty much in control of things at every step. It's like pretty much they get to decide when certain conditions have been met. And we know how that's going to go. It's just that it's always going to be decided in favor of Israel. And that's what's happening already. I've talked about some of the ceasefire violations. Again, there are organizations that total up the violations, and it's very nearly 400. I just mentioned some of them. And there's been just not a peep. There's no complaint about it. It's just like, okay, Israel has a right to, apparently, Israel can kill 24 people in a day, and it's not a problem. Right. Or they can bulldoze another 1,500 homes. That's something I failed to mention. It's not a problem. And of course, they're doing the same thing up in Lebanon. The guarantors of that plan in Lebanon, again, were the U.S. and France. And here we have basically it's the U.S. and Israel in charge of it. So we know how it's going to go, right?
Right, but that's how it's always been, and at the current state of power of the United States and Israel, that's how it will be in the foreseeable future. I mean, they won't allow for anything else, right? So, I mean, I'm just trying to see if there is some silver lining with this plan, like maybe things will slow down. I mean, isn't there talk about, like, maybe you can tell me a bit about what this plan does? Isn't there talk about an International Stabilization Force?
Correct.
ISF?
Right. That's one thing that's supposed to be put in place. But it looks like nobody's really willing to do it.
Yeah, I was about to say, has anybody volunteered? Who is this supposed to be made up of?
The U.S. and Israel, or the U.S. in particular, I don't think Israel wants anybody in there, and they're probably going to have their way. The U.S. has been looking at Indonesia, at Turkey, and, they've expressed like, oh, possibly, but I don't think that, first of all, okay, it is a real problem. Um, Turkey has gone along with this, but actually, if they send their soldiers, and their soldiers, once they're there, under whose control are they? They're really under U.S. and Israeli control. And who are they going to be fighting? Fellow Muslims, Hamas. That's what's going to happen. And Erdogan has gone pretty far, and he's gone all too far, in working together with the U.S. and Israel on these things. But there's a limit to what he can do. And I think that would be such a bad look that that's something that even he won't do. I don't think so. And I think it's true of these other Muslim countries. It's just like, okay, you kind of bent our arms and we voted for this, but we're not sending forces there to do your dirty work.
Mm. Well, I would just be afraid that I would be a tripwire, that they would use me, kill me as part of their national force, say, look, Hamas did this, and now you're immediately a combatant in this conflict as well. Like, I don't know what are the rules of engagement. What country would be willing to do that? Sure, let me send some guys in there, and are they in charge of demilitarizing? Because that's something they talked about with Hamas. Like, you doing that by force, that immediately makes you a combatant, right?
Right.
And
well, that's the thing is, they might be willing to be actual peacekeeping forces, meaning that if Hamas agreed to lay down its arms, then they could go in and just keep the peace, right? That's a possibility. But Hamas has not laid down its arms, for obvious reasons. They're watching what's going on, the violations of the ceasefire every day. And they would only, I believe Hamas has said clearly, they would only do that if they were going to transfer power to a legitimate Palestinian authority. They will accept that it could go to another Palestinian political body, but they're not going to just lay down their arms and let the Israelis run the remains of their territory there. So they wouldn't be peacekeepers, this ISF, it was sent in there. They would actually have to fight Hamas, and that's just not going to happen. Now, even if they're peacekeepers, you wonder, what will they accomplish? Because we have peacekeepers up in Lebanon, and we know what's happened up there. They call, what is it, UNFIL or something. I think that's what they're up there, and they have been shot at by the Israelis. The Israelis have basically ignored them and just pushed them aside as they've invaded and gone on on their rampage there in southern Lebanon.
Yeah, well, I think it helps just in terms that it gets more eyes on the conflict, because I remember when that happened in Lebanon, I think they fired on some Irish peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, that were holed up in a tower, tank shot at them, things like that. And it was news, and people are just more of just like the brazenness and illegality of Israeli actions was just laid bare for everybody. So in that sense, it's good. But from what we've told me so much about this plan is not something that can be implemented. You're not going to be able to get the stabilization troops, right? The ISF. What country would be willing to do it? And then even if you did, what are you telling them, that they're immediately combatants and their job is to fight Hamas now on behalf of Israel?
Right.
Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, you can see the whole thing as a joke from the start. I mean, the U.S. has established a base in southern Israel, and its stated purpose is to monitor the ceasefire. Now, I think I just mentioned that approximately 390 violations of the ceasefire have occurred on the Israeli side. You could argue maybe there were one or two on the Hamas side, even those I think are doubtful. And all the deaths, or the overwhelming number of deaths are on the Palestinian side. But that's not their concern, that they don't care when the Israelis do anything. The Israelis always have a reason why they have to. So, they have always a justification for apparently violating the ceasefire. It's really to support the Israelis. So, that's what this is going to be. And I think I talked about earlier, this yellow line may become semi-permanent, sort of like the green line and then the wall, in the West Bank. I think it's very unlikely. Again, to go to the next stage after the certain conditions are met, the Israelis are supposed to withdraw to another line and abandon more Gazan territory. Give more of that Gazan territory back to the Gazans. But they're not doing that, right? And I don't think they will. They're going to just hang on to that yellow line. They're, at some point they might start building a wall, or maybe they won't because they want to push in. There's talk actually beginning development on the Israeli side of the line, reconstruction. But it would obviously be reconstruction for Israel, for Jewish settlers likely. There was some they mentioned the possibility of certain carefully vetted Palestinians being allowed into that territory, but that would be very minimal, and it would just be it would be a token number.
Okay, so this peace plan, it more almost sounds just like kind of cover for the Israelis to continue what they're going to do, because it sounds like this peace plan can't be implemented, but they'll be able to say, oh, look, we have this great thing that Trump is trying to do and they're working on it. But in the meantime, they can just do whatever. And then it's just going to be that murky world where they're operating in, because we just talked about it. We didn't go over the whole peace plan, but there's some clearly huge problems in there. One of them being the International Stabilization Force. Where are you going to get those people? Right. What are they supposed to do there? What are their rules of engagement? It just doesn't seem possible. So,
right. And then the whole thing is governed. Again, there's supposed to be a board of peace, but who's the president of the board of peace? It's Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well,
now, the only thing you could hope for, and I don't think there's really any reason to have this hope, but it's that Trump would put his foot down and push it forward, because he does have some power there. He's the head of the peace board. He has that military base right there in southern Israel. But we've seen that it's supposed to be monitoring the ceasefire, and we see what it does and, what it doesn't do. It's just, so there's just no indication that he's actually going to push the Israelis to keep their side of the bargain. And if he doesn't, there's just no chance that this is going to ever be implemented.
Well, isn't one of the foundations of the UN Charter the right to self-determination anyway? So, is this whole thing just ridiculous that it's coming down from the UN if you're being governed by the board of peace, which is Trump and basically Netanyahu's cronies, and then there's some international force that's also ruled by the United States? So there's no self-determination here whatsoever. So, this just doesn't, I'm starting to think, the UN says that, but I feel like there's not a lot of self-determination around here. Feels like here in the West, nobody wants to do these things, and they just get to do whatever they want. Same thing with Europe. There's no self-determination anywhere.
You're talking about the elites do what they want, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But but there's some semblance. But here it's just so blatant that there's no respect for any type of self-determination. I can't even have Palestinians run.
That's what the Russians pointed out, and that's why they presented their alternative plan. Now, this plan, has some very vague language about a path to a possible Palestinian state, but it's very vague, and it's and everything is conditioned on whether on Israeli approval. And the Israelis have made it clear that, that's not going to happen. It's just Netanyahu says it seems like every other week, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. And that's what the unfortunately shows that he has overwhelming popular support for that position. Now, you're just going back to the whole thing is kind of bogus. Yeah, it is bogus. There's this supposed peace plan, and everybody has to stick with the peace plan, and this is what we got to work on. And, that's really what's happened. That is exactly what the Israelis like to have, these kind of arrangements, because this protects them from criticism and say, hey, you're an apartheid state. And say, oh, no, we have this temporary problem and we're working on it. We have this peace plan. And of course, the peace plan never goes forward. There's the Oslo process, in the West Bank, and it actually nothing ever is implemented for the Palestinians, and the Israelis just continue there with their ethnic cleansing. But when people point at it and say, oh, we got this peace process, but there's real obstacles, and you just have to be patient. Now, that really worked for a long time. I think it doesn't really work, again, with the great majority of people. People have become rightly skeptical of Israel and understand that they're lying. It really did work effectively in the past. People just sort of it was a smokescreen that allowed them to carry out a slow motion ethnic cleansing. I don't think the smokescreen is nearly as effective, but like you say, it's just people have taken their eyes off of Gaza. There's this assumption that peace has come. That's how it's reported in the Israeli papers too. It's just like the war is over, but the suffering isn't over. The ethnic cleansing isn't over for the Gazans or for the the people in the West Bank. Again, these last 2 years have been really terrible in the West Bank, not nearly as bad as in Gaza, and that's why we haven't paid attention to it. But that the ethnic cleansing really was ratcheted up there, and it's continued now. It's just like, and we're seeing it happen again in southern Lebanon. There's a wall that's being built not on the international boundary. That's an old Israeli trick.
Well, it sounds like Israel's getting away with it, or will get away with it, and I don't like to think that that's true or possible. Do you think that they will be able to just like commit a genocide live stream to much of the world, or half a genocide, whatever you want to call it?
Well, they have gotten away with it to a great. Again, I think if you want to point a finger at anybody, well, first of all, the U.S., because the U.S. enables all of this, is an active, you can say a real participant, not just passively complicit, but actively complicit. So first of all, point your finger at the U.S., but then point your finger at the neighboring Arab and Muslim states, at Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, okay? Because these are Muslim states. These are their fellow Sunnis, and they have betrayed them. It's a huge betrayal. And if they had stood up, if at some point Erdogan had cut off the oil, that could have made a real difference, but he never did.
Why?
And he even had like
too? Do you think they're afraid? I mean, I just feel like the whole
I don't think there's
world
blackmail, but
there's always some looming threat of blackmail. We talked about just the nuclear blackmail threat.
Okay, well, that's in the. I think that probably applies more to like Iran. They have to keep that into.
I know, but it just permeates throughout everybody's consciousness. Like, oh well, Israel might kill me.
I think it comes down to it. These are corrupt leaders who are. That they know that they need to condemn the Israelis, but they limit it just to these verbal condemnations. They stand by Palestine, but only rhetorically. Many of them, are personally enriched by the relationship with both the U.S. and Israel. And that's how they look at it. That's for them. Unfortunately, I think that's that's what they really care about. And the lives of these people in Gaza are secondary, or less than secondary. They just don't care, and that's a real sad truth.
Well, I mean, Israel can't get away with it completely. We've said before that just the damage that has been done to Israel has been irreparable, right? So, I mean, there is a price to pay, and they are paying it. And Israel is on, is on borrowed time. Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, again, it's just like this polls show that among younger people, like people under 50, that there's now more sympathy for Palestinians in the U.S. than for Israel. And that's, again, a huge shift. And then, the younger you get, the more that pronounced that is. So even like young Republicans under 30, it's like there's more sympathy for Palestine. That's, again, enormous. You wouldn't have seen that even a couple years ago. So there's been a seismic change, or a tectonic shift in opinion in the U.S., and I'm sure you'll find similar things in similar survey results in Europe. And that's bound to hurt them. I think there's no question about it. That is, again, they can ignore it, or they can find fixes to the problem in the short run, but in the long run, that's going to haunt them. And the Israelis, obviously they are worried about that. You're getting these very radical responses from Zionist elites in this country, and we've talked about that. So that's, they have been hurt by that. No question they've been hurt severely in the court of world public opinion. They are a pariah state, and that's nothing that's happening right now is going to change that. Now, and unfortunately, you see, within Western Europe and the U.S., the fact that the so-called ceasefire is in place has allowed governments to to even reverse the very minor sanctions that they had imposed on Israel. For example, I think in Germany there was a suspension of arms shipments. Well, now they've been renewed, or there was some suspension of some, cooperative military agreements. Now those have been renewed. But those are the Western elites. And we always knew that they weren't sincere about their protests or their condemnation of Israel. They're showing that now by their actions. But in the court of world opinion, Israel has already lost. And you can say, well, I guess, people like Netanyahu, they say, so what? We have the U.S. at our back. But they've lost the younger generation, the U.S. already. And that younger generation is going to come to power at some point.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I've said before that so many people I think are going to become one issue voters when it comes to like, are you taking money from AIPAC? Are you going over and kissing the wall? Are you saying I stand with Israel over and over again? And then that'll just be like, we're done. But then I'm also just thinking that people change so quickly. They forget about things and just move on. So it does worry me that we can just let this slide. Like, think about like how crazy things were during COVID. And now it's just like, people don't talk about it. And like, that was a crazy time, right? Are we going to reflect and think about what we did wrong and maybe try to fix things? Or just like 9/11 or Iraq. A lot of people just, just won't ask questions, just move on. And then, just all these things. So it does.
No, you're right. It's true. But it's still the damage has been done. I think there's been a fundamental, maybe you don't have the focus on Israel, but the focus will come back because other things will happen. Again, the crazies are still in charge in Israel, and they actually are not going to be, they've taken a lot. They took more than half of Gaza right here, and they took a big chunk of Syria. They took, a piece of Lebanon, and they want to take more. I think there's no question about it. But they're going to, again, those people that are in charge, who really are, Netanyahu and his coalition, those people are going to. Every indication tells us that they're drifting even farther into extremism, into this reckless, almost apocalyptic frame of mind, and they're going to be further actions. They have been emboldened by so much of what's happened, and they're going to continue to overreach themselves. And I just hope that's the sad thing again, is that you don't have any resistance from neighboring powers, but maybe at some point there will be a real revolution in these countries, in a place like Turkey or Egypt, which would make a difference. Maybe we will see a real change in policy in the U.S., but I don't foresee it within the near future. In the short run, it looks like Israel is sitting pretty, and I hate to say that, but that's what it looks like. In the long run, again, I'll just say it's looking very grim for them.
But when you're saying like it's sitting pretty, then that means that they'll start to overreach again. I mean, they're already starting in Lebanon, right? They're doing more and more actions in Lebanon and expanding, and so. I mean, there is this sort of note of or an air of inevitability about war with Iran, but that also has faded away, and I think a lot of people are like, maybe it's just not going to happen. And then I mean, I know we shouldn't want that to happen, but it felt like Iran was the only power in the region that could actually defeat Israel, just straight on. Right. Otherwise, we're going to see Israel continue to slaughter people in the West Bank and in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Syria, just sort of move slowly. This is and embolden them further until eventually something big happens. It sounds like. Is that what you see?
Yeah. Essentially, that's right. And I think it is true that Iran is the only real rival, the only country that could beat them in a war. And that's why they've been fixated on Iran for such a long time, because they understand that. It's just they want to take out Iran. And they tried, back in June, but they failed. And I'm sure they're looking for an opportunity to try again. I again, don't think it's going to happen soon. I think they need to, the IDF is really worn down. Their stockpiles need to be replenished and all that. And they need to come up with a new plan. They had this very ingenious, Operation Rising Lion, plan that they used, to achieve some kind of regime change. It failed, but it was ingenious, you have to say, and it did inflict some serious damage on the Iranians. And but that's something you can't just do again. Of course, the Iranians have, in response, have been rolling up all kinds of intelligence networks, and they realized that they had been penetrated deeply by the Israelis. And I don't know if the Israelis will ever be able to penetrate Iran in the same fashion again. So what are they going to do? Well, they've shown themselves, let's admit it, just to be very creative. And I'm sure they're cooking up some sort of diabolical scheme now.
Do you think most people in Israel support something like that?
Well, unfortunately, they do. That's one thing, I'm struck because, again, I follow the news in Haaretz, which is the, flagship left-wing newspaper within Israel. And sometimes you get some genuinely good and compassionate articles about the Palestinians there. But it seems like when it comes to Iran or Hezbollah or anything else, they're actually just completely in agreement with their government. Even this Netanyahu-led government and the IDF and everything that they do against Iran or Hezbollah seems to be justified. I didn't see any sort of reflection on the morality of their decapitation strikes in both places. There does seem to be general support. There is general support for those kind of attacks and wars.
Hey, doesn't that surprise you? Don't you find that a little bit odd? I mean, for several reasons. I mean, the Israelis saw what Iran was able to do to Israel.
Yeah.
Hypersonic missiles landing in Tel Aviv. You can't hide that. That was intense. Those few days were crazy. And so aren't they aware that, like, hey, this is not good for us. This could mean our destruction.
Yeah.
And then the other thing also is just, they're a small country, and they travel. They have ties to Europe and the U.S., and they travel. Every time they travel, they have to hide the fact that they're Israeli. Because they're hated globally. Don't you think at some point there's some kind of self-reflection, like maybe there's something wrong that we're doing in my country, and I should speak out against it because that's not a good feeling. How does a whole country just be okay with this type of being a pariah?
Yeah. Well, they're not okay. They are aware of that problem. Again, I've seen several articles in Haaretz about that, about the the general, let's say, discomforts, worries of Israeli tourists abroad, and the very uncomfortable situations they find themselves. They get kicked out of restaurants and so on and so forth. And, fairness to the leftists in Haaretz, they do understand that the way they look at this is because of the policies of Netanyahu. And, this is, we need to stop. He's gone too far. He has provoked this hostility towards us. So there is that awareness. And I think there's up to a point. But even on the left, you find the kind of the reflexive self-justification, which is, it's just anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head. It just, there's a reluctance even on the left, and I think it's, when you get to the right, it's just not even there. A reluctance to self-reflect, to ask, maybe it's something that we're doing. There's this knee-jerk reaction. It's anti-Semitism. Anybody who criticizes us, anybody who's hostile to us, it's just because they have this irrational disease, which is called anti-Semitism. And it can't be anything that we're doing. Unfortunately, that's what you find, I think, in the majority of Israelis. But there is a significant minority that is aware of that and is bothered by that. Because I think a lot of the leftist Israelis are also, cosmopolitan, travel often. And they see what's happening. They see that there have been real consequences to the actions of their government, and they are disturbed by it.
Well, do you think that will manifest into any actual change within Israel? Like because that's always something that you kind of hope that maybe Israelis have this, as Biden said, a come to Jesus moment.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, no. And it's something that even the leftists themselves discuss among themselves, is just say that they are a minority, and they are a cowed minority, meaning that they're actually kind of afraid to stick their necks out. And a lot of times there are threats of violence when they do. There are brave individuals that have spoken out against the genocide, and they get death threats. And the thing is, you have to be, death threats get thrown around, and the great majority of them, like in this country, can be safely ignored. I understand that not to justify the death threats, but that's usually it's just talk. In Israel, you really have to ask the question. These people are violent, and they have power, and so when you get a death threat, well, it's scary. You just don't know if a mob is going to show up your house or somebody's going to assassinate you. It could happen. So in general, that, let's say, dissident community, which is already very small, is even less effective than its numbers would indicate. It's just they're afraid to speak out.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's two things kind of going on. There's Israel's continued aggression into Gaza, Lebanon, the West Bank, and eventually that might spark, and Syria, and eventually this might spark something larger. But then there's the other thing that is going on here in this country, even though that Gaza might be starting to sort of fade from some people's minds and memories. The U.S. influence, Israeli influence in U.S. politics is not gone away. That still is a battle that's being fought front and center.
Very much
and so I think in that sense, Israel can't get away with it. They might be able to get away with Gaza. And unfortunately, for so many people, like here domestically, it's like, okay, it's not being shown on our TVs and phones so much anymore. We just forget about it. But seeing what's happening here in this country and how the Israel firsters and the Zionists are just at war with a lot of the American firsters, I think that can't disappear. And so many people, I think, used to just have when they thought of Israel back in the day, it was just like, oh, that's just our friendly country, one of our good allies, and they're similar to us. That's about as far as they went. Now this association with Israel has been tainted, and I don't think that can fade away. So even though Gaza might forget, people will just have sort of this visceral reaction when they hear like, oh, he supports Israel. I don't like that. And so I think that's
I think that's right. It's like, I think the last episode you were talking about how your generation, the next, well, it's really, I guess it's Generation Z. I can't keep track of these generations, but it's the younger, like the under 30s. Their, the formative experiences and connection to Israel are so very, very different from, let's say, the experiences of my generation. And I had to go on this long journey to understand what was happening in Israel. And it actually took some real effort. I had to go to some unusual bookstores and that kind of thing. That's the way it was in the past. But they have, they have grown up. They never had that respect for Israel. It wasn't, and what they remember, like maybe their real first memories of Israel, are, the horrible, the horrible genocide within Gaza, and that's not going to go away. That's, I think, been burned into them, and that's that's their starting point, and it's going to be that into the foreseeable future, and that again does not bode well for the future of let's say American support for Israel.
Right, and I think couple that with just the economic malaise in this country, as things become more and more unaffordable, especially for younger people, like the first time they're able to buy a house now is close to 40 years old. People just can't afford to live in this country and live the American dream that our, parents and grandparents had. It's not the same thing anymore. And when that happens, people are going to look for people to blame. And it's always scapegoating. I'm not saying that all of the blame is valid, but a lot of people will be angry at countries like Israel that have been hijacking what they thought was the United States government to focus on Israel's priorities rather than America's priorities. When people here in this country are saying like things are really, really bad, we need to focus things like, oh, hold on, shut up, we got to give more money to Israel, help them out some more, and we'll give you guys a 50-year mortgage so you can be in debt for the rest of your life. This isn't going to fly. So I think in that sense, it's a very negative outlook, but that's what needs to happen to break this relationship with Israel. I mean, but it's also just been, you saw Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's resigning,
Yeah.
like she was one of the few people
Right.
in Congress. Now there's just Thomas Massey left basically.
Yeah.
And,
Well, you do have people on the
Democrats,
Democrat
Ro
side
Khanna,
that are very, but I think it's particularly valuable to have those people on the right. There has been again, like you find among young Democrats, the support for Israel has just essentially evaporated. It's just not. It's probably in the single digits or something. I think that's right. On the Republican side, yeah, it's actually evaporating pretty rapidly, but there's still a residual support for Israel, and so I think it was particularly important to have those. It is important to have those voices there, and I am sorry to hear that Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to step down in January.
Yeah. There's talk about her going for president in 2028. She's denied it, but Polymarket is showing her at like 7-8% already. But that's people are saying. Yeah. One last thing that I don't know if you noticed that that X released a feature recently that shows the location of users, and the Department of Homeland Security. It showed that the account was opened in Israel and is operated out of Tel Aviv. That's what it showed there. And there's a lot of screenshots and videos of it. And as soon as that happened, they disabled that feature, and then they re-released it, and then it changed for the Department of Homeland Security. And people saying, Grok was saying, oh, it was a glitch. What kind of glitch? I mean, that's not how code works. It doesn't just randomly select land on a country. There's a reason it displayed Israel. I mean, even if you're using a VPN first of all, why would you be VPNing from DC into Israel? It doesn't make sense. Very fishy. But there's just more damnations. It's like, that's unbelievable, though. The Department of Homeland Security was created in Israel and for the United States, and it was operated out of Tel Aviv. Like, if that's true, which I have every reason, I don't see anything that can convince me that it's not true. I can just say it. I'm not going to believe this is just
I
a
think
glitch.
it probably reflects the huge, unwarranted role that Israeli IT companies play in the U.S. government. They're just. This comes up again and again. For example, there's software that the U.S. government uses provided by Israel, and then it's discovered that there's a back door, and the Israelis have been using it to, snoop on us, and that's just sort of a constant news item. I mean, that comes up again and again. So I suspect this is something similar. It's just like some sort of IT company. Well, we'll set up the website for you. Don't worry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is just creating the X account. I mean, through the Israeli App Store. I mean, it was
right.
They were
you think that they would
just there, So it's just like,
that's true. Yeah, good point.
It's wild. I mean, if that's true that we've been using Israeli tech all the time, we always know that it has a back door, then it begs the question, why do we keep on using Israeli tech? It's because they have people on our side as well, in our government, that are pushing it and saying, yeah, we use this, use that. And it's like, well, so the problem, we really truly are an occupied country, Like, I don't know if that's too much of a hyperbole.
Yeah,
It's
maybe,
insane.
when it comes to Middle East policy, I don't think it is.
The Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
I mean, they even create that account in America. I mean,
that's pretty weird.
It's Homeland Security.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean they actually control it. Let's
but
be careful about what we say. There's obviously undue influence, and when it comes to, again, I think Middle Eastern policy, to say control is, maybe a little too strong, but it's basically true.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can leave it there unless there's anything else you want to say about.
No, I think we can leave.
Okay. Yeah. We should try to talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine. So, I mean, the big news, of course, is this peace plan that has been put forward by Trump. Right. And for me, the biggest thing about this peace plan, we can go into whether you think it's any way that it could end into an actual peace, but I think it's just an admission from the West that it cannot sustain this conflict. I feel like this peace plan has taken the wind out of the sails for the Ukraine war effort people.
Yeah, they're trying to get the wind back in the sails the best they can, and they may succeed. Again, I think Trump is behind this, but Trump is he blows one way and then he blows the other. That's the thing. But he has come back to this position, again and again, where he does. There are moments of realism, and I think we're in one of them right now. He seems to recognize, maybe he talked to J.D. Vance, had some good long conversations with him or something. I'm not sure what it was, but he has come to realize that, the Ukrainians are losing, and I could have an Afghan moment or a Saigon moment on my hand, and I need to do something. Yeah, let's do this deal now. It's the 28-point peace plan. There are different versions out there, so we don't even really know which one is the real peace plan. There was one that was released by the Ukrainians. I think that was the one that came out earliest, and I've read over that a couple of times. But then there's another version that was published by The Telegraph, another version published by Reuters, and there's probably other versions floating around. Now, the funny thing with this so-called peace plan is that the way it is being reported or described in Western media is that it's basically that Trump gave everything to the Russians. So this was, there's even a story going around, I think, that was spread by General Kellogg's daughter, who is a very avid Ukraine supporter and actually lives in Ukraine, and said that it was written by the Russians. So this is, and then translated from Russian, into English. And that's just absurd. I've gone through it, and there's some things in there that the Russians would like, for example, no NATO membership. But there's a lot in there that they clearly are not going to agree to and did not come from that. There is talk about, retreating from the remaining 14% of Donbass, but in that they wouldn't actually have true sovereignty in that remaining 14%. They would not be allowed to send their troops in there. It would be a buffer zone. There is talk about a ceasefire down in Zaporozhye and Kherson, but it's not a temporary ceasefire, which is the way I think the Russians always understood it. We'll stop fighting for now, but these oblasts belong to us, and we'll negotiate how they're going to be returned to us. No, in this 28-point peace plan, it's permanent. So the Russians would give that up forever. There's a cap that's put on military forces, but it's 600,000. At least in this one version. I think in the Telegraph version, it's maybe 800,000. But it's funny how that's reported in the West. Like this would be a huge concession by the Ukrainians because they have a 1 million-man army. I think it's well understood they don't, and we can see it, what's happening on the front. They don't have 600,000 men on the front right now. If they did, we wouldn't be seeing the Russian advances that we are seeing right now. But that is, I think that's a cap that would be too high, according to the Russians. That's way too high, a 600,000-man army. And then also the Russians are supposed to give up control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which has been under the control since 2022. It would be actually administered by the IAEA, and the power generated from that would be split between Russia and Ukraine. There are other things, but I think the most important thing, there are other provisions that clearly the Russians wouldn't ever accept, but the most important thing is that at the very end, it says that this plan will be implemented and monitored by the Peace Council headed by Donald J. Trump. And that just looked at that and says, that's Gaza all over again. You see how they monitor and implement plans. So he gets to decide. In the end, it's like it doesn't even matter what you write down because he gets to interpret it all. And this is pretense that somehow, like in Gaza, that the U.S. is a neutral third party when they were actively complicit in that genocide. And they, if you want to point to one country that was responsible for sparking this war, I think. Anyway, you can make the argument that it was the U.S. and the U.S. has been involved at it, at every level, everything from satellite surveillance, all the way down to tactical direction and training and everything. We've gone through that. They've been so deeply involved in this war on the Ukrainian side, and now we're going to have So one side gets to monitor it and implement it, and that's so the
Well,
whole thing. I don't think this was written in Russian. Let's just put it that way.
just to say the absurdity of it, the losing side, the side that loses, gets to monitor and interpret the plan. That's
Right.
It's absurd. It's ridiculous.
Right.
But you're saying that even Europe is saying that this is somehow giving Russia everything.
Oh, yeah.
Even though it seems to be the opposite in many ways.
Right.
I mean, especially like what you're talking about. Trump gets to decide everything at the end.
Yeah.
So, well, what is Europe saying? Is Europe saying we have to defeat Russia and we march on to Moscow? I mean,
well, they rushed out an alternative plan, which is basically just a ceasefire, but with the understanding that Russia would have to cede all the territories, and that again there can't be any prohibition on NATO membership. There can't be any cap on the.
So Russia has to lose, basically. Has to wave the white flag
The
and
reparations,
lose.
and then no cap on the military, and nothing about protection for Russian language and Russian minorities and the Orthodox Church. That was there in vague fashion in the 28-point plan. It's just that both sides agree to abide by the principles of respect for linguistic and ethnic minorities or something. That was, I think, but clearly, again, it's just like the Europeans were supposed to do that when they admitted the Baltic states, and in the Baltic countries, the Russian minority has clearly, they are clearly second-class citizens, and they are not treated as full citizens, and they clearly, that's in violation of EU principles, but it doesn't matter to the EU. So, anyhow. Yeah, so they, just like the media, basically they're saying this is terrible. This was written by the Russians, and their alternative plan is basically like the Kellogg ceasefire plan. Just we'll have a ceasefire, and then we'll get the Russians to agree to pull back from these territories. We'll negotiate with them and say, if you do this, we'll start to remove the sanctions. They seem to believe, both the Europeans and the Americans, that the Russians are absolutely desperate, that they want the sanctions to be removed, and that's a huge carrot that we can use and dangle over them. There's language in the 28-point peace plan that said that they will be removed gradually and on an individual basis. And say, like, if the Russians fall for that, it'll never happen. Again, they get to decide when they're removed, and they never will be removed. Probably not in our lifetimes. But the Russians have just accepted that, and they've gone on. Their economy has grown more since the outbreak of the war than the U.S. economy and the NATO economies, without question. They would probably like to have them lifted, but it's not existential for them. Yeah.
This whole war it's been just so crazy watching, so frustrating, just seeing how that the West doesn't have any leverage, but they still are trying to dictate the terms, especially the Europeans, the ones that have zero leverage, and they're constantly trying to dictate terms and sabotage. And it's really frustrating because it's like, well, clearly what we're coming to this acknowledgement of this peace plan, like I said, was kind of an admission that they can't sustain the conflict. It's too expensive, running out of money, running out of weapons, running out of men. So we have to do this, but they don't. The terms are going to be dictated by the Russians because they won. They are winning, but there's just no acknowledgement of this. I just don't understand.
Right.
Like even let's say even if for some reason Russia says, okay, we'll agree to it. How are you, the West, supposed to even enforce anything like this? You lost the war. What are you going to do if Russia says like, oh, you guys aren't upholding your bargain, we're continuing to march? Right. What are you going to do? Go to war with them? That's what you're doing now. You're going to put sanctions on them? You've already tried that. Like there's no, it has to be, Russia has to dictate the terms, and they have to make the West accept it. That's how it works, right? There's no, and we keep on playing this game where somehow the losing side is going to dictate the terms.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, they won't admit that they're the losing side. Clearly there is some realism that's penetrated into the White House. I think there are occasional flashes of realism in Donald Trump's brain. J.D. Vance has shown, when it comes to Ukraine, he has shown an awareness of the reality there over time, even going back, well before the time that he was elected or entered into office as vice president. But in European capitals, with of course the exception of Hungary and Slovakia, and maybe to a lesser extent the Czech Republic, there's just no realism. They still are living in this fantasy world, and they find themselves kind of unable to escape it. They're just living in this dream world, this la la land, where they get to, Russia is still the Russia of the 1990s, and back then it was. Well, sometimes we forget that it was not just Putin that complained about like the expansion of NATO. Yeltsin did too. And he would bring it up. He said, this is bad. We're very worried about this. There are a lot of, you've got to stop this. And they just say, yeah. And, there were reports that would come back to Clinton and the White House and other, and State Department officials and other officials within Europe about this. The Russians are very upset. This is this is creating real problems. They find this completely unacceptable. And they say, yeah, I kind of understand their point of view, but who cares? They're a third-rate power. I mean, I think that was the language that was actually used by some of the officials. And that was the attitude. And it seems like they just can't, they still, everything has changed, but they just can't escape that mindset. They still live there, but it's become increasingly absurd. It's amazing that they hold on to it. I think it's because that mindset is very tightly wedded to a sense of moral superiority. And often when I read these articles talking about this is terrible, that Trump put forward this plan, it's very, very moralistic. Russia is the evil aggressor and Ukraine is the innocent victim, and we have to stand on side of the innocent victim. There's a complete lack of realism there. And it's just this, if you live in a world of morality where somehow by some coincidence, you're the good guys and the other people are the evil, then you can't compromise with evil. So this is just incomprehensible. I think that's the flip side of it. And these two things work together. Is this kind of habit of superiority that goes back to the 1990s and certainly before. But then this kind of this sense of moral purity that cannot be besmirched by actually compromising with the evil people on the other side. Now, of course, I think again, it's like this kind of let's say morality, if you want to call it, I think it's a very false morality. But yeah, it is a false morality because it's unmoored from reality. And that kind of morality in the end produces horrible outcomes. And it's destroying Ukraine. They say that if you actually love Ukraine, if you love the people of Ukraine and you want to spare them, you need to be realistic and understand what the real choices are, what the real options are. I saw just recently, it was actually, I think it was maybe an X post written by the former press secretary of Zelensky, a Ukrainian, who was very much a Ukrainian patriot. He's saying she's just sick of hearing all this. She said, look, our men are dying out there and they're going to keep on dying. The Russians are winning and this is the best that we're going to get. If if for the sake of Ukraine, accept this. That's what she was saying. And she's completely right. It's just like if you go back, we've talked about this, that, look, offers have been made to Ukraine again and again by the Russians before the war, right after the war, and each time the terms from Russia are worse for Ukraine. What makes you think that a year from now is somehow going to be better? That what's inevitable, of course, is many more Ukrainians will die, more Ukrainian territory will be lost, and that any sort of peace plan offered by Russia is going to be even harsher. Is there any reason to believe that's not true? Is it the 20th sanctions package that's going to do it? I don't know. It may be, occasionally Scott Bessent says something that was true. It was him or somebody, another U.S. official. It says that if you have a 19 sanctions package, that tells you right there that it's not working, right? That's what it is. But it's going to be the 20th that does it, or the 21st, and it's going to be the Taurus missile that does it. We've heard all this, and you say, come on, people, reality, and it's. Real morality is founded on morality, right? It's not, it's not just a question of, what the deal you can get for Ukraine now, but it also says, okay, let's look at this realistically and make an effort, instead get off of our higher moral ground, where the Russians are just, evil orcs and we're saints and, with shining halos above our head, and stop and really ask some hard questions. Like, maybe we provoked this war. Maybe we made some mistakes that helped to lead up to this war. There's a complete refusal to do that because they're obsessed with the sense of moral purity, and that any hard questions, insistence on looking at the reality is treated again as some sort of Russian plot. And as long as they're in that kind of mindset, they're not going to get out of this delusion. They seem to be very, very show no signs of escaping from it at this point.
Yeah, well, the European elite, they have that coupled with this notion of U.S. military supremacy. So there's just this idea that I think that, okay, we have the moral position here, or we got to fight the Russians, but, maybe we're not that strong, but our best friend, our ally is the most powerful country in the world. So we can win any war. So we just have to hang in there, and then we can get the U.S. in there. And so it's this problem, I think, of U.S. military supremacy that they also cannot admit, and they can't. And so they're just thinking that, like, we have the moral position and we have the military might position. But the reality is that they don't have either.
Right.
And then they can't admit it. But I think many of them, they just cannot accept the fact that the U.S. is not the dominant military power on the globe.
I think that's probably true within Ukraine, too. It's just this sense that, well, okay, the Americans have helped us and sent us weapons, but they have held back because clearly we know that, they are the supreme power. And if they really wanted to win this war on our behalf, they would send us these super weapons and the quantities that we need, or they would directly intervene. I think there is that belief, both within Ukraine and the rest of Europe. I think you get more realism in the U.S. There are a lot of people who obviously believe that in the U.S. The majority, I'd say, certainly of the elites and the general population as well. But there are a lot of people in the Pentagon that actually know, how many weapons are left in the warehouses and how many they can produce, and they know how the weapons they've sent already have fared on the battlefield. Like what was it just the other day? Some 5 ATACMS were fired into Russia, and all of them were shot down. The Americans are going to know that, and they're going to be talking about that among themselves. And I think occasionally that truth just rises to the top, gets through to the president and other decision makers.
There's some talk about Trump wanting to freeze this conflict and end this conflict in Ukraine so he can pivot somewhere else, either to Asia, to Venezuela. What do you think about that? Is that? I mean, as crazy as it sounds, it does feel like there are more China war hawks that are really brewing, and we're seeing, Takaichi getting a little chipper over there in Japan with China, so over Taiwan. So do you think that there's something at play there that we're? Yeah,
well, there clearly is a very powerful faction within the State Department and the Pentagon that really wants to focus on China and sees the Ukraine war. I don't know how powerful they are, but there is a faction. There are people like that. And they do want to make that pivot to China. They see China as enemy number one. They originally a lot of them were for the Ukraine war because the idea was that, okay, we'll use this to severely weaken Russia, and maybe even achieve regime change, get a new kind of Yeltsin-like regime in there that we can control. And then we'll be strengthened vis-a-vis China. There were some that said that, we read the opinion pieces in the papers about that. Now they see that that's just not working. And so they say, well, let's just get out of here. And that's not a majority view, but that is there. Who is it? His name escapes me at the moment, but it was an assistant secretary not of defense, but rather of war, that has always been a China hawk and has been pushing that position. So yeah, there is always that possibility, and that argument is always floating around, within the top ruling circles.
But I mean, if that is the case, if there is some kind of pivot to Asia, I mean, this is just further just shows the weakness of NATO. You can't handle what's happening in Europe, and now you're going to go to over to Asia. And if there does something stir up over Taiwan, and we use our Japan proxy or Taiwan proxy or whatever, then you split NATO into two again. It's like what you're just leaving this. The idea is just to say, Europe, you got this. That's half of NATO is you guys, right? So you handle that, and we'll handle this over here.
Right. Well, of course, it's not really NATO when we go to the to East Asia, though there has been an effort to actually bring in those American
South
allies.
Korea and Japan are like observer NATO members.
Right. They have a kind of They do have some status vis-a-vis NATO, but they're not full members.
Right, on the opposite side of the Pacific, as far away from the North
kind
Atlantic.
Of long ways from the North Atlantic, exactly. But I mean, it's clear that like if the U.S. couldn't win this proxy war, then what are they thinking in Asia? But they haven't given up on it. There was that paper that came out recently. I think it was called "Stabilizing the Relationship with China," that was put out, and it showed it was a welcome. It was a Rand paper, which is again very closely associated with the defense establishment, and saying that, hey, basically, we can't beat these guys, and we just have to learn to get along with them.
I like that plan.
Yeah, no, it made a lot of sense, and so there was some excitement, like within dissident circles, when that plan appeared. But I've heard that it was just in the last couple of days that it was withdrawn. That paper, it was essentially, it's been disappeared. So, the China hawks are clearly still ascendant.
Yeah, it is a very mainstream narrative now. Just this vilification of China. I see it everywhere. Yeah. Fox News is all about it. This evil Chinese. It's like it's frustrating. I mean, as somebody that's lived in China and just knows what the Chinese are like and they're about.
Right.
They're not out to get anybody. They've
shown that they haven't. They haven't attacked anybody since 1979. There was that what was it, a 1 month, 2 month war against Vietnam. That was it. It is silly. Again, you don't have to like the Chinese government. This is the problem, again, with, substituting, replacing realism with morality. You have this morality that's unmoored from this morality that is unmoored from the reality, and that just leads us into deep trouble. Oh, these evil Chinese, we disapprove of what they do here. They disapprove. Again, so much of this is exaggerated, and it's not. You have to look at the whole country and experience the people in balance. And by and large, the people there, as are I would say happier with their government than our people are.
Definitely.
Happier with their government.
Right.
You don't have to like them. There are all kinds of reasons why you might disagree with Chinese policies. But look, they're a superpower. That's a fact. And you just can't pretend that they're not. And they're going to have influence in their neighborhood that you cannot, in the long run, I think even in the short run, you really can't counteract. There was a time when you could, you could have this very moralistic view because you did have this supreme power. That's one thing I think maybe that's the problem, is that we've been this supreme power for such a long time, or for decades after World War II, where we didn't, with the exception of the Soviet Union, but let's say vis-a-vis China, certainly, throughout that time, we were so much more powerful than them that we could afford to kind of indulge in this, in displays of moral purity. Let's just put it that way, because we didn't really, we could steam through the Taiwan Strait, and there was nothing the Chinese back then could do about it. But this day they could easily sink one of those ships. They could sink our whole fleet over there. And I think that just have to say, all right, I don't like them, but they could sink my whole fleet. They're a superpower. That's their neighborhood. We have to just respect that, and behave accordingly and learn to get along with them. That's realism is, in the end, I think, much more moral than idealism, the ideologically driven foreign policy.
Do you expect anything to kick off over there in East Asia, over Taiwan?
There's always the possibility, a lot of, again, this is, people have been talking about it for decades. I lived back in Taiwan back in the 1980s, and people would talk about it. So that was a long, long time ago. I think back then there was no chance. China was still so much weaker militarily than the U.S. that they wouldn't attempt it. But again, the tables have turned, and the Chinese clearly are more powerful in that part of the world. They really could sink our whole fleet. Um, Now they have shown tremendous patience. They do say that Taiwan must return to them, but they I think clearly would prefer to do it diplomatically through negotiations, and they're going to pursue that. But if they feel like all their efforts are exhausted, and maybe we can like compare it to what happened with Minsk, the Russians spent basically 8 or 7 years waiting for Minsk to be implemented, and there was no effort. And then we know what happened. If they feel like all diplomatic efforts are exhausted, and especially if the Taiwanese government crosses that red line and declares independence, I think they will act. Now, I've heard again people say who actually know quite a bit about China say that they think that'll never happen. They got their eyes focused on the bottom line, on trade and whatever, and this would be harmful and this would be bloody, but I think there's maybe two things that we need to look at right there. So first of all, this is something that's for them is really emotional. I talked about the century of humiliation, and this is sort of like a vestige of that. It's just a part they look at and they see Taiwan basically under foreign control, like in the pockets of the U.S. And that's like the last part of that century of humiliation that is still on Chinese territory. And they do want it to end. I think it's something that's very visceral to them. And I think a lot of outsiders don't understand that. And then also, it's just that things have changed. Not only have they become militarily much more powerful, to the point where they clearly they would win a war, fought there right along their coast, their southern coast. But also, they're economically so much more powerful that the threat of, let's say, some sort of like loss of trade with the U.S. doesn't induce a fear that once did. That was something that I think maybe held them back. But we've seen what's happened. The U.S. has attempted that, through the tariff war that Trump launched back in the spring, and it failed. And the Chinese showed that they were not afraid of it. They had made the calculation they could live without the U.S. And so that is something that's changed too. So their risk benefit calculation is changing, and it's changing in favor of some kind of action. It's not to say that they're going to do it, but I think as time goes by, their patience isn't endless. There will be a time where they say, okay, we've tried, and it hasn't worked, and now we know we can do this. We're confident we can do it. Yeah, there will be some consequences, but probably not even the greatest the consequences that the Russians suffered. And look, the Russians are holding up just fine. We can do it. We'll win this war. We'll take back Taiwan. We'll end that century, that last bit of that century of humiliation. It'll be over, and we will have, permanently erased it from our territory and from our psyche.
Do you think Takaichi's comments and the fact that I heard she has moved some medium-range missiles onto some islands in the south of Japan to cover Taiwan, do you think actions like these are going to accelerate some type of action from China to reunify?
Yeah, they obviously don't help. I think they push in that direction. And I think the more that we take kind of a militaristic approach, the more likely it is that they're going to respond in a military fashion themselves. Again, kind of similar to what happened in Ukraine. We began pumping Ukraine full of weapons. We began talking about building naval bases there or whatever. And that alarmed the Russians and led to the SMO.
But it just seems even crazier to try to make Taiwan Ukraine. First of all, yeah. Taiwan is a smaller population, around 25 million. And it's an island right off the coast of China. With Ukraine, it's this massive country that's got Western Europe on the other side that's just funneling in equipment here. China could just instantly put a total embargo on Taiwan and no ships coming in and out. It's over. It's like you can't supply that. You can't sustain that. That's impossible. So it just it just so this is why I feel like that we've just lost our mind. It's just so insane to think that we could try to pull off something like this with Taiwan. But we talk like we can, and then you see Prime Minister Takaichi, saying such crazy stuff, saying that we'll intervene militarily, over Taiwan, and not walking back her statements. He said this has got China riled up. And the fact that she's not wanting to back down from it is just insane. I just don't understand. Well, what's the game plan here?
I don't know. You're right. I suspect again that probably they received tacit support from the U.S.
Yeah, I think there was the ambassador to Japan said that we have your back, Japan. Like the
and the Taiwanese are completely on our side. The current president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, has said that he's going to eat lots of sushi and that they're going to send their tourists to Japan. And a lot of Taiwanese have to be upset, making fun of that and say, wait, I'm sorry, but look, this is just not realistic. We cannot, we cannot compensate for the losses that they're going to be suffering. Taiwan is tiny, and it stopped yapping like a little, chihuahua here.
Also, how does this make a lot of Taiwanese people feel? Because,
that's what I was saying. They're obviously he has his supporters, the Taiwanese nationalists who really do want to break away from Taiwan and see themselves as having a separate non-Chinese identity. They are there.
You froze up,
but I think they're a minority now, and a lot of Taiwanese have ridiculed his statements. You have kind of, for some reason, I'm not.
Okay, it's
frozen.
back now.
Okay,
yeah, we both froze, I guess.
Okay.
Oh, all right. Well, I didn't hear the last 30 seconds or so, but I think we've gone on pretty far. So
I think we can stop there. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
There.
Right.
Okay. Sure. All right. Okay. All right. Thanks a bunch, Dad.
All right.
I'll talk to you soon. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.